Once upon a time, it was just an island, battered by winds, invaded by tribes, ruled by kings with swords and crowns. But what rose from this small patch of land changed the fate of the entire world. The United Kingdom didn't just survive history, it shaped it. From the roaring thrones of medieval monarchs to the sun that never set on the British Empire, this nation commanded oceans, crushed rebellions and redrew maps. But power comes with a price. Revolutions, world wars, loss, glory, and the fight for identity. The UK has seen it all. So how did this island nation become the world's most powerful empire, and then lose it all? And what legacy did it leave behind? This is not just history. This is the story of empires, blood, brilliance, and rebirth. This is the epic tale of the United Kingdom. From island nation to global empire, let's unfold 1,000 years of power, politics, and prophecy. Long before the modern concept of the United Kingdom existed, before Big Ben, red phone booths, and royal weddings, this land was a chaotic patchwork of warring tribes and shifting identities. What we now call the UK was once home to ancient Britons, Picts, Celts, and Gaels, each fighting for territory, survival, and spiritual dominance. There was no England, no Scotland, no Wales. Just scattered peoples, surrounded by seas and shaped by centuries of invasion and resilience. The story begins with mystery. The prehistoric builders of Stonehenge, the enigmatic Druids, and early Celtic tribes left behind monuments, legends, and whispers of a spiritual and tribal life tied deeply to nature and the stars. But history took a sharp turn when the Romans arrived in 43 AD under Emperor Claudius. For nearly 400 years, Britain was part of the Roman Empire. They built roads, baths, walls like Hadrian's Wall, and cities like Londinium, the ancestor of modern London. The Romans brought order, infrastructure, and governance, but they never fully conquered the northern reaches of what is now Scotland, where fierce resistance persisted. When the Romans withdrew around 410 AD, chaos returned. The power vacuum left the island vulnerable to waves of invasions. The Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, Germanic tribes from across the North Sea, poured into Britain, pushing native Britons westward and establishing their own kingdoms. It is from the Angles that the name England is derived, Angle land. These invaders brought their language, their gods, and their warrior culture, laying the early foundations of English identity. Pagan kings ruled through strength and fear, often waging war against one another for land and control. In the shadows of these dark ages, a new force was quietly rising: Christianity. Missionaries from Ireland and Rome began spreading the Christian faith, which slowly replaced paganism. Monasteries became centers of learning, culture, and power. This spiritual shift helped unify the fragmented kingdoms under a common belief system, setting the stage for political unification. However, just as England began to organize itself, another storm approached the Vikings. Beginning in the late 8th century, Norse warriors from Denmark and Norway launched brutal raids on coastal monasteries and towns. They came for gold, land, and power. But they didn't just plunder, they settled. They established the Danelaw, a region of England under Viking rule, and clashed repeatedly with Anglo-Saxon kings. Among these kings, one rose above the rest: Alfred the Great. Ruling from Wessex in the 9th century, Alfred successfully defended his kingdom from Viking invasion, fortified towns, promoted education, and laid the groundwork for what would become a unified England. His vision was not just survival, it was legacy. After Alfred, his successors continued the dream of unity. England was eventually unified in the 10th century under King Æthelstan, often considered the first true king of England, but peace was fleeting. In 1066, one of the most defining moments in British history occurred: the Norman conquest. William, Duke of Normandy, claimed the English throne and invaded with a mighty army. At the Battle of Hastings, King Harold of England was defeated, and William became William the Conqueror. This conquest changed everything. The Normans brought with them a new ruling elite, a new language, Old French, new architecture like castles and cathedrals, and a new system of feudal governance. English society was transformed from the top down. The Anglo-Saxon nobility was replaced, the church reorganized, and law codified in new ways. Yet, the Anglo-Saxon identity didn't disappear. It merged with Norman influence, giving rise to a uniquely English culture. This fusion of Roman infrastructure, Anglo-Saxon grit, Viking resilience, and Norman control forged the medieval English crown. Over time, as England expanded its influence, it clashed and united with neighboring realms, Wales, Scotland, and eventually Ireland, forming what we now call the United Kingdom. But none of it would have been possible without those early centuries of struggle, bloodshed, and vision. The United Kingdom, as we understand it today, was not born in a moment. It was forged over centuries, in battles, in churches, in royal courts, and on muddy fields, from scattered tribal lands to a monarchy that would one day rule over a quarter of the earth. The story of Britain's beginning is one of survival, conquest, and transformation. This was the birth of a kingdom, and it was only the beginning. As the crown of England gained power, so too did the tensions between rulers and the ruled. The birth of the English monarchy brought with it not only prestige, but also a dangerous concentration of authority in the hands of a few. Kings were seen as divinely chosen, answerable to no one but God. But the people, the barons, the clergy, the merchants, and eventually the commoners, would not be silent forever. The story of Britain is not just one of monarchs and wars, but of a long, bitter, and often bloody struggle towards something truly rarer, democracy. Following the Norman conquest, England was under a foreign ruling class. Norman kings built mighty castles, imposed feudal laws, and centralized power like never before. The monarchy tightened its grip on land and loyalty, demanding taxes and military service, while leaving little room for dissent. But absolute power always breeds resistance. The seeds of rebellion were planted as early as the reign of King John, who became a symbol of tyranny in the early 13th century. His constant wars, heavy taxation, and brutal methods pushed the barons to their limit. In 1215, they forced him to sign a document that would echo through history, the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta wasn't a declaration of democracy as we know it today, but it was a revolutionary step. For the first time, a king was made subject to the law. It established that the monarch could not levy taxes without consent, could not imprison nobles arbitrarily, and had to respect certain legal rights. Though King John had no intention of honoring it fully, the idea took root. It would be reissued and reinterpreted many times over the centuries, each time pushing the kingdom closer to constitutional rule. Even as royal power grew in display through palaces, armies, and grand ceremonies, its foundation was beginning to crack. The rise of Parliament, originally a council of nobles and clergy, became central to English governance by the 14th century. Kings still ruled, but increasingly they needed Parliament's approval, especially to fund wars. The balance was delicate and often dangerous. Monarchs like Edward I and Edward III wielded enormous influence, but the institution of Parliament grew stronger under pressure, slowly evolving into a voice for broader sections of society. Still, monarchy would not loosen its grip without a fight. The 17th century brought with it the most direct confrontation between king and country. Under King Charles I, tensions reached a boiling point. Charles believed in the divine right of kings and refused to listen to Parliament's demands. He dissolved Parliament repeatedly, raised money through controversial taxes, and alienated much of the political and religious establishment. Eventually, these tensions exploded into the English Civil War. From 1642 to 1651, England tore itself apart. Royalists loyal to the king clashed with parliamentarians led by Oliver Cromwell. The war was not just about power. It was about what kind of nation England would become. In 1649, a decision was made that shocked the world. King Charles I was put on trial, found guilty of treason, and beheaded. For the first time in history, a sitting European monarch had been executed by his own people. The monarchy was abolished. England became a republic, ruled by Cromwell as Lord Protector. But even this experiment in republicanism would not last. After Cromwell's death, the monarchy was restored in 1660 under Charles Sicu, but things would never return to how they were. The power of the crown was reduced, and Parliament's role became more entrenched. A second major confrontation came in 1688 during the Glorious Revolution. Fearing a return to Catholic absolutism under King James II, Parliament invited William of Orange and his wife Mary, Protestants, to take the throne. But there was a condition. They had to accept a Bill of Rights. The English Bill of Rights in 1689 limited the powers of the monarch, ensured regular sessions of Parliament, protected free elections, and prohibited cruel punishments. It marked the true beginning of a constitutional monarchy, one where the crown reigned, but Parliament ruled. This moment fundamentally reshaped British politics and inspired revolutions across the globe, including in America and France. The journey from royal absolutism to representative government was neither straight nor peaceful. It was forged in rebellion, war, and negotiation. Britain did not become a democracy overnight. The vote remained restricted to landowners and men of wealth for centuries. But the principle had been established: rulers must be accountable to the people. Over time, Reform Acts expanded the electorate. Women won the right to vote, and the House of Commons overtook the House of Lords in legislative authority. Today's British democracy stands on the shoulders of this long struggle. From barons on horseback to protesters in the streets, the road to democracy in the United Kingdom is a testament to the resilience of those who dared to challenge power, and to the evolution of a kingdom that chose to govern not just by the crown, but by the will of its people. The transformation of the United Kingdom from a regional power into the largest empire in human history was neither accidental nor immediate. It was a long, calculated process driven by ambition, exploration, commerce, and conquest. At its peak, the British Empire covered nearly a quarter of the Earth's landmass and governed hundreds of millions of people across every continent. This vast global reach did not emerge overnight. It was built through centuries of strategic expansion, naval dominance, ruthless colonization, and the exploitation of both resources and people. The story of the British Empire is not just about glory and flags planted in distant lands. It is also about the complex and often painful legacy that still shapes the modern world. It began at sea, in the wake of the Spanish and Portuguese empires' dominance in the 15th and 16th centuries. England was initially a latecomer to global exploration, but driven by competition, economic needs, and a hunger for prestige, English adventurers, merchants, and pirates began to explore beyond their coasts. Figures like Sir Francis Drake, John Hawkins, and Sir Walter Raleigh became famous not only for their daring voyages, but for raiding Spanish ships and establishing early trade networks. The sea became the lifeblood of British ambition. The creation of powerful trading companies like the East India Company and the Royal African Company allowed Britain to extend its influence deep into Asia and Africa, not just through military might, but through commerce and cunning. The 17th and 18th centuries marked the empire's aggressive rise. Colonies were established in North America, the Caribbean, India, and West Africa. The sugar plantations of the Caribbean and the tobacco fields of Virginia enriched British merchants, but this wealth was built on the backs of enslaved Africans, transported in horrific conditions across the Atlantic in one of history's darkest chapters. The transatlantic slave trade. British ships carried human cargo, and British ports thrived on the profits. While the empire expanded, the suffering it caused expanded with it. Entire cultures were displaced, and millions of lives were forever altered. In India, what began as trade evolved into domination. The East India Company gained political and military control over vast territories, often playing rival Indian factions against each other. With their private armies and financial power, the company acted like a government, collecting taxes and imposing laws. After the Indian Rebellion of 1857, the British Crown took direct control of India, making it the jewel in the crown of the empire. India became central to Britain's global status, providing resources, soldiers, and strategic value. Yet behind the facade of imperial order lay economic exploitation, famine, and social upheaval. Britain's rise to global dominance was cemented during the 18th and 19th centuries through a series of conflicts and victories. The defeat of Napoleon at Waterloo in 1815 removed a major European rival and allowed Britain to dominate global trade routes and colonize with minimal resistance. Innovations from the Industrial Revolution gave Britain technological superiority, enabling it to build railways, telegraph lines, and modern ports in its colonies. Tools of control masked as progress. In Africa, the empire carved up entire regions during the scramble for Africa, often with little regard for existing ethnic or tribal boundaries. British colonial administrators imposed foreign systems, cultures, and borders, many of which continue to spark conflict today. Yet the empire also cultivated a myth of benevolence. British leaders claimed they were bringing civilization, law, and Christianity to the world. This belief in a moral mission became the ideology behind empire building, justifying conquest under the guise of duty. In reality, the benefits of empire were rarely shared with the colonized. Education, infrastructure, and governance served the needs of the imperial core, not the people on the ground. Resistance movements were crushed, dissent silenced, and cultures undermined in the name of order and progress. At home, the empire fueled national pride. British citizens viewed their country as the world's guiding light, a global power bringing unity to a fractured planet. Stories of brave explorers, gallant soldiers, and distant conquests filled newspapers, books, and schoolrooms. But this nationalistic vision ignored the cost of imperialism. It ignored the uprisings, the massacres, the exploitation of labor, and the loss of identity experienced by colonized peoples. The empire's wealth flowed into Britain, building magnificent cities, museums, and institutions, many of which still house the artifacts of foreign civilizations taken without consent. By the dawn of the 20th century, the British Empire was unrivaled in scale. It stretched from Canada to Australia, from India to Kenya. The phrase, "The sun never sets on the British Empire," was not just poetic, it was literal. But behind the imperial grandeur was a fragile foundation held together by force and illusion. The world was changing, and the very forces that built the empire, commerce, communication, and conflict, would soon begin to unravel it. Yet in this moment of apex, Britain stood at the center of global power, ruling more people and land than any nation in history had ever dreamed. The British Empire, once vast and seemingly invincible, began to face its greatest tests in the early 20th century. Though its territories still spanned continents, the forces of nationalism, war, and political change were gathering like a storm. The empire that had ruled the seas and commanded millions would soon face challenges, not just from beyond its borders, but from within. The 20th century would not only bring two devastating world wars, it would bring the slow, painful unraveling of British imperial power and the transformation of the global order. When the First World War erupted in 1914, the British Empire mobilized like never before. Millions of soldiers were drawn not only from the British Isles but from colonies across the globe. India, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, Africa, and the Caribbean. They fought in muddy trenches, foreign deserts, and distant battlefields for a king and empire that many had never seen. The war was long and brutal, and though Britain emerged technically victorious, the cost was staggering. The empire bled financially, emotionally, and militarily. The war shattered illusions of European invincibility and opened the eyes of many colonized peoples who began to question the justice of fighting and dying for a power that denied them basic rights at home. The aftermath of World War I left Britain with enormous debts, a declining economy, and growing unrest in its colonies. In Ireland, years of struggle culminated in the partition of the island in 1921, creating the Irish Free State. In India, the movement for independence surged under leaders like Mahatma Gandhi, who employed non-violent resistance to shake the foundations of British authority. The global empire was beginning to creak under the weight of its contradictions. While the British elite still spoke of duty and civilization, the realities on the ground told a different story, one of inequality, exploitation, and growing resentment. Just as the empire struggled to stabilize, the Second World War broke out in 1939. Once again, Britain called upon its colonies, and once again they responded. Soldiers from India, Africa, and the Caribbean fought bravely alongside British troops, often in thankless roles. The war against Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan became a moral crusade for freedom and democracy, but for many of Britain's colonial subjects, this message rang hollow. How could an empire that denied self-rule to half the globe claim to be fighting for liberty? World War II was even more devastating than the first. London and other major cities were bombed, industries were drained, and Britain was left deeply weakened. But the psychological blow was even greater. In 1941, the fall of British-held Singapore to Japanese forces stunned the world. It was the largest surrender in British military history and marked the symbolic end of British invincibility. The myth of the empire as a permanent, unstoppable force had been broken. After the war, Britain found itself in a new world, one dominated not by empires, but by superpowers. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged from World War II as the new global leaders, and both opposed traditional colonialism. At home, the British economy was in ruins. The government could no longer afford the cost of empire. The moral and political climate had changed. Colonized nations were no longer willing to wait for freedom, and the age of decolonization had begun. One of the first and most significant moments came in 1947, when India, long considered the crown jewel of the British Empire, finally gained independence. The partition of India and Pakistan came with violence and tragedy, but it also marked the beginning of a tidal wave of change. Over the following decades, Britain saw colony after colony break away: Ghana in 1957, Nigeria in 1960, Kenya in 1963, and dozens more. Some transitions were peaceful, others were marked by conflict and bloodshed. In some regions, like Kenya and Malaysia, Britain fought violent insurgencies before granting independence. In others, local leaders negotiated their way to freedom. But the trend was irreversible. The empire was dissolving not in one sudden collapse, but in a series of deliberate and painful steps. At the same time, Britain was redefining its global identity. It retained influence through the Commonwealth of Nations, a voluntary association of former colonies and allies. Many countries continued to recognize the British monarch as a symbolic figure, but true power had passed. Britain also began to focus inward, dealing with its own social changes, rebuilding from war, and adjusting to life without the imperial burden it had carried for centuries. The fall of the British Empire was not simply a decline. It was a transformation. From a nation that had once dictated terms to the world, Britain became a participant in a new, multipolar global order. The loss of empire brought reflection, humility, and the need to adapt. The world had changed, and Britain had to change with it. The age of empires was over, and in its place rose the complex web of nations, partnerships, and struggles that define the modern world. As the empire receded and the sun finally began to set on the global dominion of Britain, a new chapter began, one not defined by conquest, but by reinvention. The United Kingdom emerged from the rubble of 2 world wars and the collapse of its imperial structure with deep scars, but also with a renewed purpose to find its place in a world it once dominated. Modern Britain is the story of transformation, from ruler to partner, from empire to influence. No longer an imperial superpower, the UK redefined itself through diplomacy, culture, innovation, and its continued, though altered, presence on the world stage. The post-war years were a period of rebuilding, reckoning, and reinvention. Economically weakened, Britain faced challenges on every front. Infrastructure lay in ruins, industries were outdated, and the British people, exhausted by years of war, were ready for change. The nation turned inward to heal, establishing one of the most significant welfare systems in the world. The National Health Service was born in 1948, offering free healthcare to all citizens, and became a symbol of British resilience and social progress. These years marked a shift from imperial dominance to domestic responsibility, a pivot that reshaped the national psyche. But modern Britain was not isolated. While the empire dissolved, the relationships it created did not. The Commonwealth of Nations, formed from the remnants of the empire, offered a platform for former colonies and the UK to cooperate on trade, diplomacy, education, and cultural exchange. It was no longer about ruling others. It was about maintaining relevance through partnership. Queen Elizabeth II, who ascended to the throne in 1952, became a stabilizing figure throughout this transformation. Her reign spanned the transition from empire to Commonwealth, from global ruler to constitutional figurehead in a modern democracy. Immigration transformed the face of Britain. Citizens from the Caribbean, South Asia, Africa, and elsewhere, many from former colonies, arrived in Britain in large numbers, especially during the post-war labor shortages. The Windrush generation, beginning in 1948, brought thousands from the Caribbean to help rebuild the nation. This influx brought both vitality and tension. Multiculturalism became a defining feature of British identity, even as it sparked debates about race, integration, and national values. Over the decades, Britain evolved into a diverse and cosmopolitan society, with London standing as one of the most multicultural cities on Earth. In the global arena, Britain shifted its power base. It became a founding member of NATO and the United Nations, aligning itself with the West during the Cold War. While it no longer held imperial authority, it remained a key diplomatic player, often acting as a bridge between Europe and the United States. Its nuclear arsenal, permanent seat on the UN Security Council, and historical weight gave it a voice louder than its size would suggest. Yet Britain was also challenged to prove that it still mattered without the reach of empire. The late 20th century brought new challenges and decisions that would define Britain's modern identity. One of the most profound was its relationship with Europe. Joining the European Economic Community in 1973, later the European Union, Britain sought economic and political stability through integration. But skepticism remained. For decades, debates over sovereignty, immigration, and identity simmered beneath the surface, finally erupting in the 2016 Brexit referendum. The vote to leave the EU shocked the world and divided the nation. It signaled a new phase. Britain choosing independence over integration, tradition over transformation, nationalism over supranational unity. Yet despite the turbulence, Britain continues to wield influence, though now more through soft power than military might. British culture, media, music, and education still resonate globally. The BBC, British universities, and global brands like the Premier League, James Bond, and the Royal Family project an image of Britain that remains iconic. London remains a global financial hub. British diplomacy, intelligence services, and development aid still shape outcomes in many parts of the world. The influence may no longer be imperial, but it is far from insignificant. The monarchy too evolved. While the royal family remains largely ceremonial, its symbolic power still commands attention. The passing of Queen Elizabeth II in 2022 marked the end of an era, while the ascension of King Charles III represents continuity and change in equal measure. The monarchy's future will be tested by a younger, more questioning generation, but for many, it remains a link to history, identity, and tradition. Modern Britain is a nation that has learned to navigate decline with dignity. It has accepted that its role is no longer to rule the world, but to engage with it wisely. The transition from empire to influence has been imperfect, often painful, but undeniably powerful. The legacy of Britain's past still casts a long shadow, but within that shadow, the country has carved out a new identity, one built not on conquest, but on contribution. In the great theatre of nations, Britain still has a voice, not because it once ruled the world, but because it now understands the world it helped shape. From scattered tribes and ancient stones to world-shaping empires and modern diplomacy, the story of the United Kingdom is not just a tale of kings and crowns. It's the journey of a nation that dared to rise, dared to rule, and dared to change. It rose from blood-soaked fields and fractured lands to stand atop the world as a global power. But it didn't stop there. It transformed, shaped by rebellion, reason, and resilience, into a democracy, a partner, and a symbol of enduring influence. The British Empire may have faded, but its legacy echoes across continents, languages, governments, and ideas. It left behind wounds, yes, but also connections. It left behind division, but also unity. And in the aftermath, it found a new strength, not in domination, but in dialogue. Modern Britain stands not as an empire of flags, but as a force of culture, thought, and diplomacy. From Shakespeare to Churchill, from the Magna Carta to the NHS, its story is a reflection of the human spirit, proud, flawed, but always evolving. So when we look at the United Kingdom today, we don't just see a nation. We see a mirror of world history, of what power can do and what wisdom must follow. This is not just the history of a kingdom. It is the story of how the world was changed by an island that refused to be small.